Shawn, in the AFC West, there's a couple teams that I want to talk about that are exciting. And the big thing when we talk about the schedule, we talk about the ways that the AFC West will go this year. The big thing for me is sort of the tale of two conferences with who they'll play against. So they will play the AFC North, which is a very tough division. They'll also play the NFC South, which, you get the Falcons. Falcons are expected to win that division by current odds. You get the Saints, you get the Bucks, you get the Panthers. Those are some winnable games. And so that is interesting for a couple teams in the AFC West. The first one that is, I think we kind of always wind up talking about, but the Chiefs have an 11.5 win over under. It's tied for the highest line over on DraftKings. There's two other teams at 11.5, the 49ers and the Ravens. Both of those teams have been bet solidly to the under. You can get, if you wanted to take the over on either of those teams, not only can you get, no vig, you can get plus money. You can get at least plus 115 right now as we're recording this to bet the over on 11.5 on them, which makes sense. There's just a lot of chaos in the NFL, and a lot of people are just going to bet under on the really extreme lines. I say that only because the Chiefs are the other team at 11.5, and there is no juice on either side. So there are some people that are willing to bet the over on the Chiefs. And yet the fact that you can get the Chiefs over 11.5 at minus 110 almost feels like that should be juiced up the other way, the over. They went 11-6 last year. And so, that's the key note. But I did just mention, look, they get to play the NFC South this year. They do have to play the AFC North. There's 4 good teams in the AFC North. They got to play all their division teams twice. There's some tough teams there. They'll have to play a first place schedule, which requires them to play the Texans and the Bills in the other AFC divisions. And when they play, their 17th game is against the NFC West, which will pit them against the 49ers. It's a tough schedule. There's a lot of good teams there, but we do this with the Chiefs every year where, they play a first place schedule every year because they are in first place every year. And it's like, these are a lot of good teams. The 49ers are a good team. All the teams in the AFC North are good. Baltimore, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh. Those are all losable games, basically. But the Chiefs are a really good football team. They're not going to lose all of those games. I think people start to count the losses and they go, that's a loss, that's a loss, that's a loss. They probably are going to go 11-6. But the Chiefs, they're better than a lot of those teams. They're probably more likely than not to go like 4-2 in those 6 tough games, if you will, or maybe it's 4-3 or what have you. But if you're saying their 7 most difficult games are 4-3, and then, they're going to probably give one away to a team they shouldn't lose to because they do that every year once or twice. But you start to get to where you're like, it's kind of hard to see them winning fewer than 12 or 13 games. And by the way, that is backed up by their results prior to last season. And I just wanted to emphasize this because since Mahomes took over, they went 12-4, 12-4, 14-2. And then we go to the 17. That was 16 game seasons. Then we go to the 17 game seasons, 12-5, 14-3. And then last year they go 11-6, but then they win 4 playoff games against 4 really good teams. They end up 15-6. If you count the playoff wins, they win the Super Bowl. They were 15th in points last year, Shawn, on offense, 9th in yards. At no other point in the Mahomes tenure, the 6 years that Mahomes has been their starting quarterback, have they been lower than 6th in either points or yards. So last year was the heavy offensive outlier, but the big note was that they were 2nd in points allowed, 2nd in yards allowed on defense. Their defense was incredible last year. They've lost a few pieces, but they do still have a strong defense heading into 2024. And again, like the issues going into the postseason and late in the regular season for people with the Chiefs were the pass catchers. It was so glaring. That was their one big problem. They go out and they get Xavier Worthy. They get Marquise Brown. They get all of these pieces where things are looking up heading into 2024, quite a bit up compared to what we had in 2023. A reminder for people who don't recall, they were playing Sky Moore and Marcus Valdes-Scantling as their 2 highest snap rate wide receivers for most of the first half of the year. They really slowly trickled those guys down. They finally turned things over to Rashee Rice in week 14 is when he finally played like a full snap share and ran a full route share, a lot later than players that are typically doing well in their rookie year. We don't know what's going to happen with Rice and the potential suspension and all of those things. But what we do know is that the first half of the season, the Chiefs are more likely to be playing better talents. Marquez Valdes-Scantling is gone. They've kind of given up on this guy, more experiment. I don't know where else they would go than to some Xavier Worthy. They're certainly, I think, going to play Marquise Brown, who's a veteran that they brought in. They're going to have more weapons on offense. Shawn, last year they scored 371 points in 17 games. Their lowest in any other season with Mahomes was 451, a full 80 points higher, and that was in a 16-game season. So, you prorate that. It's more like they were not within 100 points of any of their other seasons. They've been 473 or higher in the other 4 years with Mahomes as their quarterback. I don't think you bet on 2023's offensive production to stick this year. And again, that was bad enough that they went how much below this 11.5 line? They went 11-6. They missed it by a half a win and then went on to win 4 playoff games against 4 really good teams, some of who they'll have on the schedule again this year. They got the Bills again. They got the 49ers again. But again, they beat those teams in the playoffs last year. They're capable of winning those games in the regular season. They don't seem to take the regular season as seriously anymore. But I just wanted to highlight this where it's kind of fascinating that they've been a 12-plus win team every year with Mahomes at quarterback, 5 of the 6 years and until last year. We get the 17th game. They were doing it in the 16-game seasons before. I feel with their defense where they're at, I feel pretty good about taking the over on this number, especially when they match up with the NFC South.
And you mentioned that they play the first place schedule, and that brings in some tough teams. At the same time, one of the reasons for that is they don't have to play themselves. And I would make the argument that the other 3 teams in the AFC West are in the fairly early stages of rebuilding. And so it's not that you're locked into going 6-0 against those teams by any stretch. They're NFL teams. 2 of the coaches in that group now are very, very accomplished head coaches. You're going to get some difficult games anytime that is the case. And yet, I really think, the only path that you have to finishing with fewer than 12 wins is a Patrick Mahomes injury, and quarterbacks do get hurt, or like somehow having Kadarius Toney get back on the field and lateral the ball to opponents at the end of like 3 games.
Yeah, right? That's 3 times.
That's how those games were lost last season. I can't be particularly unbiased about the Kansas City Chiefs, obviously, but one of the things we talked about kind of going into the playoffs as that defense was rising is that despite where they were from a scoring perspective offensively, that might be the best of all of the Kansas City Chiefs teams. And you could make the argument that played out in the playoffs with being able to beat both the Ravens and the 49ers, the other 2 like huge power teams. And then you go into the offseason and you add those 2 wide receivers, where that should completely change the offense again for the reasons you're mentioning. But then the other thing is, and you alluded to this, but they do lose Snead. They had a fantastic back end to the defense. But, I mean, it's those guys who are putting the pressure on, who have now made the Chiefs in so many ways a team you simply can't even move the ball against. I mean, you think about what Lamar Jackson and the Baltimore Ravens did at home in that playoff game. They had absolutely no answers, and the Chiefs just signed Chris Jones to a 5-year, $159 million contract. Getting that part behind them and having that player there to be the foundation for their defense, I think that, anytime you make a comment like this is going to at least verge on hyperbole, but I don't think it's a mistake to look at the 2024 Kansas City Chiefs as they go for the three-peat, which – whether or not they do that, I mean, that's much more difficult, obviously, than getting over this 11.5 wins. This is the best team that, on paper, the best team that Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes have had together. I'm definitely going over.
Yeah, that's, I think the point is that you got to look at it, understand why they struggled a little bit last year, see how they've addressed it, and come to that conclusion that this is one of, if not the best, as you just said, teams that they've had. And you look at their losses last year when they went 11-6. famously didn't have a great point differential last year and won some one-score games as well. But they had that loss in the first game against Detroit where Kadarius Toney had the ball bounce right off both of his hands on a short crosser and go for the pick six, and they lose by 1 point, 21-20. They had a 4-point loss to the Eagles at home, a 3-point loss to the Bills at home, a 6-point loss to the Raiders at home. Certainly games that in one-score settings that, they're not always going to go against the Chiefs, who have a really great quarterback. They did get beat kind of bad at Denver last year by 15, and then they lost to the Packers. Their other loss was to the Packers by 8 on the road. That's the game where the Packers successfully really slowed the game down, and then the Chiefs also kind of played into it and ran the ball with Pacheco a ton. I just had to look this up to remember. I knew there was really low drive counts on both sides. Both teams basically had 7 drives. The Chiefs technically had 8, but they had a 1-play drive where they just kneeled to end the half. Both teams basically had 7 real drives in that game, which is crazy. You don't ever see games where teams have 7 drives. And that was because every drive in that game on both sides was a really long, slow drive. The Packers were able to reduce the possessions and then win on efficiency, which is what Underdog should try to do. The Chiefs kind of played into that. It was one of those weird games, but for people who forget, that was one of their other losses. You look at those games, you're like, yeah, I mean, they lost those games. They also won some games that they got lucky. They beat the Chargers in week 18, 13-12. There's some weird games in there the other way as well. But just pointing out that there were some winnable games, especially you look back at that Lions game at the start of the season, some winnable games throughout their season last year that they lost. And then for them to go on and beat the Dolphins, the Bills, the Ravens, and the 49ers in the postseason 4 in a row obviously says, positive things about them as well. And this is a better team heading into 2024 from week 1 than the team that Kansas City put out there in week 1 of 2023. And so, I guess that's you could contest that statement on the defensive side because the defense was so good all year last year for the Chiefs. But I think that's a pretty fair one when you look at the offensive improvements. So they're a really fun one. And Shawn, as you mentioned, a big part of that is the rest of their division is so weak. You have, the Raiders are starting either Gardner Minshew or Aiden O'Connell. Antonio Pierce is going to be the head coach. They do draft Brock Bowers. They have Devontae Adams. They have paths to being a little bit fun and interesting. I think Gardner Minshew is a pretty decent player if he's the guy. But that's a team that's not looking like they're going to be hyper competitive this year. They have an over-under win total of 6.5. It's been bet to the over a little bit. The Chargers are at 8.5. A lot of people liking them. They have Justin Herbert. They bring in Jim Harbaugh. You can understand some of those reasons, but you could also see some scenarios where the Chargers aren't quite as good as expected. Maybe the whole plan to just build a massive offensive line and not get any skill players backfires a little bit. Maybe the fact that they don't have really any strong running backs or receivers that we can be really confident in is a problem for their old school offense. We're all kind of just saying Jim Harbaugh is going to do this and it's going to work, but I would say at least mildly concerned that it's not going to work. But that their 8.5 win total has been bet up quite a bit to the over. And then you have the Broncos, who are the other team in this division that I actually want to talk about. Shawn, you told the listeners some really great information about Bo Nix in the pre-draft period. Right before the draft over at Stealing Signals, I wrote a couple things that were sort of like some hot takes about things that might happen in the draft. And then I think I wrote things that I just want to happen. And I wrote 3 of them. 2 of them didn't happen. The one that did happen was Bo Nix landing with the Broncos, which I didn't think we'd see all these quarterbacks go so high, but he does land with Sean Payton. It's the perfect fit. We've talked about all the reasons why. He's already getting glowing reviews, Shawn, in camp. And I saw something that highlighted his downfield passing, which is something you've talked about a lot with the stats, where he did have the low ADOT. He had a really high completion percentage, but when you control for the underneath throwing and all of that stuff with SIS's data, he still looks really accurate down the field. And we've talked all through that recently. But the fit with Nix in Denver is so interesting as it relates to the season because, you think about the best ball format, you think about the needing to get quarterback depth, maybe 3 quarterback builds. We've talked about in best ball, the late round quarterbacks that are worth hitting on in recent years. You think about many other formats. I think less the seasonal format as it relates to Knicks specifically, but the pricing of the skill players for Denver, Javonte Williams, where he's going, Cortland Sutton is a really cheap wide receiver 1, and basically everyone else in this offense is going well into the double-digit rounds. If Nix actually is the really good fit and is hyper accurate right away and is a Sean Payton quarterback, and Sean Payton's able to run the offense he wants to run more than he was able to last year with Russell Wilson, which I don't think is crazy to suggest. When you think about the skill set, you think about the offenses he ran with Drew Brees, and you think about Russell Wilson's skill set. I'm not saying the Bo Nix is going to step right onto onto an NFL field to be immediately better than Russell Wilson, but we should. I mean, Russell Wilson wasn't great last year. We should consider the possibility that we're uncertain with rookie evaluations all the time. It's very possible that Bo Nix has a real ceiling. You suggested at one point in the pre-draft period that he might be the second best quarterback in this class. When you look at a lot of the numbers, you put him with a quarterback coach, a guy who can emphasize Nix's skill set. You give him, Sutton and Marvin Mims is obviously an interesting player. We talked a lot about. We don't know, you certainly don't like to see the rookie season he had, but we don't know how much of that was related to things maybe out of his control. Maybe there's some meat left on that bone. They also get Troy Franklin, Nix's top target in college. You get, the system, the ability to throw to the running backs a lot, and something that Nix does incredibly well. Sean, I'm in a few of these eliminator leagues for the Fantasy Cares eliminators that are a really fun way to raise some money for the great causes that Scott Fishbowl is involved in and all of those things. And they're a quarterback heavy format. I was in the 3rd round in one, and I was really excited that Nix made it towards the end of the 3rd round, and I took him in one. And then I'm in another one, and I had an early 3rd round pick, and I was looking at the quarterbacks that were there, and the ADP was suggesting, Bryce Young, Derek Carr, and Drake May were sort of the next 3. And I was kind of looking through which of those guys I think has the best odds because it's an eliminator format. The bottom score gets dropped off every week. Which ones have the best odds of playing all 17 games and being consistently good and all of those things. And I wound up bypassing all 3 of those and just going down to Nix and taking Nix because I felt like that was the best combination of safety, security, floor, and likelihood to start all of the games, and then also upside, because there's this possibility that the accuracy stuff that you've talked about is a hit immediately. And the Sean Payton offense is really strong with Nix at the helm. I don't know how much that will be great for the downfield weapons. It never really was amazing for all of the Saints receivers for how much they passed and how big of numbers Drew Brees would put up. It was usually like one guy, whether it was Marcus Colston or Jimmy Graham or Michael Thomas. It was, and then the rest of it was just sort of rotational, it seemed like. And so maybe it won't be a massive hit for wide receivers or tight ends. Maybe that part of it isn't quite as exciting. But if the offense is good, there will be touchdowns. There will be splash weeks. So, at the prices even the Marvin Mims, the Troy Franklins, even if they are sort of rotational, I think we'll have usable weeks and be assets for best ball if Nix is really good. I'm saying all this, their over-under is at 5.5. It's very, very low. It's juiced to the over. But again, the AFC West gets the NFC South. They're going to play the Panthers, the Falcons, the Saints, the Bucks this year. They're going to play the Raiders twice. They're going to play this Chargers team twice that maybe will beat them both times, but maybe they can split with the Chargers. They've got some other tough games in there, but they won't play a first-place schedule like the Chiefs will. So when you look at the other divisions that they line up with, they were in 3rd last year. They don't play the 49ers from the NFC West. They play the Seahawks. They don't play the Texans. They'll play the Colts. That's a tough matchup. They won't play the Bills. They'll play the Jets. That's a tough matchup, but not as difficult of a schedule as the Chiefs will get. And 5.5 wins. I just love that over. And as you think about it for fantasy, Nix feels like a really great play right now considering he's still going behind the Bryce Youngs and the Derek Carrs, who to me, I mean, Bryce Young's got some upside, I guess, in year 2 if Dave Canales can really get him going, but Nix just feels like a much better floor to ceiling bet than that right out of the gate.
And it has been exciting to get positive early reviews. Some of that is going to just depend on, how coaches want to couch things in order to get their team ready. So, I mean, obviously the Patriots are saying that Drake May needs a lot of work, which again is what the stats also suggest. I don't think that's a huge surprise. We know that he's got arm talent. Can he do the other parts of it? But when you're thinking about it from a fantasy perspective, and then also how you would expect the seasons to develop for these teams with the rookie quarterbacks, we'll be doing the NFC in a different show. But right now, it seems like there's a much, much, much greater chance, if not, almost 100% chance that Bo Nix is locked into more games than either May or JJ McCarthy. And basically what I just mean by that is that those other two guys do seem like they're in a battle for the start in week 1, which that can very quickly change by week 2, week 3, week 4. It may just be a game or two. I mean, Nix is going to be the guy. He's going to come out of the chute as the starter, and they could be off to
his
the races.
Backup. You talk about the backups in those spots. Jacoby Brissett, Sam Darnold. His backup is Zach Wilson, and then Jarrett Stidham.
So I think the backup is Jarrett Stidham, right?
Yeah, I guess it's Jarrett Stidham.
And you look at this Denver Broncos team, they were minus 56 last year in point differential. A huge chunk of that comes in a game where, I mean, they really needed a mercy killing rule against the Miami Dolphins early. And then they come on. And again, you have the rookie QB. You can't discount that. There's a huge difference between where they're going to be QB-wise and where the Chargers are at the quarterback position. But the Broncos otherwise are essentially a year further into the rebuild than the Chargers are. And you look at both of those teams as they try and fix salary cap problems, the Chargers kind of across the board, the Broncos obviously related to Russell Wilson. They kind of have to make these small little signings and hopefully build a little bit around the edges. Now, if you want to make the argument that the Chargers are now an elite organization because they have Harbaugh and that every little thing that they do is going to be like this smart, tiny piece that they've added, then I guess you can get to this line that they have here. But this is a team in the Chargers last season that couldn't run the ball. Justin Herbert again struggled as a passer. Their defense was catastrophically bad. And they didn't, and then they lost talent, right? You lose Keenan Allen, you lose Mike Williams, you lose Austin Eckler. You can say maybe Eckler is washed, that doesn't matter. But the pieces that they've added at running back in order to, build this kind of ground and pound system, I mean, those guys are not difference makers at all. It's going to be a very weak running back group. It's going to be a very weak receiver group. The Chargers are going to be good with this combination of Harbaugh and Herbert, but it doesn't seem like they're going to be good in 2024. Right? I think sometimes when a team makes the moves that they need to make and they get into this transition from a poorly run franchise to one that is going to be elite in terms of all the little things, then you think it's going to happen instantly. And I don't think that's the way the Chargers are even trying to do it, right? And this is a multi-step process for them. I don't think that Bo Nix has to necessarily be that good for the Broncos to finish second in this division, where the Raiders, in some ways, you could argue, are not even into the rebuilding process yet. This is a little bit of a bridge season where they give Pierce, who did a fantastic job in the second half of last year. I love to see these guys get a chance, and sometimes it does work out, and they do have some fun offensive pieces. But again, when you go back to the quarterbacks, are we saying that the Raiders with O'Connell, a late round pick, and Minshew, kind of a journeyman, and a journeyman we like, but that those guys, that team is going to be significantly better on offense than a Denver Broncos unit that has Sean Payton, has these receivers? One of the things that's kind of interesting, even at a spot that, we would argue doesn't actually make that much difference for reality football, is that they've now added Aldrick Estime and Blake Watson in the battle that's probably a four-way battle with P. Ryan. I would guess on the outside now. Peyton is going to get to choose the guys who accomplish what he wants. So I think you either get Javonte Williams as a bounce back player who ends up being a league winner, or you have him more or less gone entirely, and you're having Estime and then these small, athletically dynamic, potential elite receiving backs round out that rotation. And we know that the dynamism at the running back spot and how that works for a quarterback who's going to throw a lot of balls underneath, that's going to be important for them in a way that it might not be for all of their teams. I mean, the Chiefs have basically turned their running back into a completely irrelevant position. That's not true with Denver. And I mean, the other thing here that you alluded to, but I think is so important to mention, is just that Bo Nix doesn't have to be that great of a passer because he has elite mobility and he doesn't take sacks. So the number, and I think that it's a very reasonable pushback to say, yeah, I mean, he didn't take sacks in the Pac-12. That's not where he's going to be next year. But the rate was so low and his mobility is so high and his ability to make the decisions and pull the trigger is so elite. Again, it's going to be a very different offense. Can he transition that decision-making to the NFL? But if you don't have a lot of negative plays, I mean, the Broncos should be decent. I'm not saying that they're going to win the division, that they're going to make the playoffs. I don't think that they will, but this line makes absolutely no sense.
It doesn't make any sense. And to your point about Nix's skill set, that's what the scheme is. That's what Sean Payton wants you to do. That's what he had to like coach Russell Wilson to do and like teach him to throw to the running backs a little more than he had in his whole career. And I think Russell Wilson has a much better year last year than he did in 2022. I think you had to look at that favorably, that Sean Payton did some very positive things relative to what Nathaniel Hackett put out there as their coach in 2022. But when you were talking about the Chargers and Harbaugh and where they're at, whether they're ready to contend, all of those things, it is a little bit reminiscent of the Broncos with Sean Payton in 2023, where it's their first year under this new regime and they're going to try and do some things differently. Sean Payton had the quotes in the offseason where he's like, yeah, Russell Wilson's not going to have all of his whole team. And, we're not going to do it that way. We're going to do things differently. This is a Denver Broncos team that was so talented that they gave up 70 points to the Dolphins in week 3. They gave up 35 and a huge come from behind loss against the Commanders in week 2. They started 0-3. They started 1-5. One of their losses in there was to the New York Jets, 31-21. That was a Zach Wilson-led team, although in fairness, the Jets had a defensive touchdown and a safety in that game, and Breece Hall had a 72-yard touchdown run. So Zach Wilson didn't actually do a whole lot to lead them to 31 points there. But the defense was really struggling. Sean Payton sort of shifts gears and makes the Broncos one of the most boring teams in the NFL. They start doing things really slowly to try to stay somewhat competitive in these games and not give up 35 points a game. And they come back and they win a bunch of games and they finish 8-9 with a pretty bad roster last year. The roster's not massively better. They had a ton of dead cap with the Russell Wilson thing. It's not like they're in a situation where they can take advantage of the rookie quarterback window yet because they have all that dead money from the Russell Wilson stuff. And yet their quarterback play could be frankly better, or at least better suited to the system this year. It's just fascinating to look at this team go 8-9 last year. And that's the kind of thing where you say, okay, Jim Harbaugh does a lot of good things as a coach. Maybe they go 8-9, but people are betting the over heavily of 8.5 for the Chargers. If they go 8-9, you win plus money on an under bet there. Not sure that I have a strong opinion on the Chargers, but I do. And we both do. We agree on the Broncos at 5.5. For them to get that many games worse, 3+ games worse than last year, especially with the division getting a little weaker, and especially with the NFC South on the docket, like we were talking about, there's a lot of winnable games for them. They're going to win 6 games with Sean Payton, with Bo Nix this year.
I mean, you could get almost all the way there just playing the NFC South and the Raiders.
Right. I mean, it wouldn't be surprising if they did get all the way there, that they won both against the Raiders and all 4 against the NFC South. That'd be 6 wins. That would get them there. Yeah, so they're a fun one to look at as well. Anything else in the AFC West that stood out to you?
No, I'm excited to see how those teams develop, and I am rooting for Antonio Pierce. I do think it's a developmental division, and I think we're really looking at 2025 when those teams make the jump. And it's a very stark contrast to the AFC East and the AFC North, where almost all 8 of these teams are pretty close to being all in. The exception would obviously be the New England Patriots, but I mean, these two divisions are going to be battles.